Are conspiracy theories inherently irrational? This is a quick view of the frequency of use of the term conspiracy theory in books between 1920 and the present day from the Google Books Ngram viewer. You can see it used to be rather uncommon. It began to rise a little bit in the 50s and noticeably accelerated after the assassination of President Kennedy, although I am inferring a relationship there. Flattened during the 70s and began to rise sort of almost exponentially to the present day. And the term conspiracy theory is ubiquitous now. It reflects a viewpoint pervasive in intellectuals that there's something totally irrational about conspiracy theories. Now, if pressed on detail, they have to admit, well, there are some conspiracies. But the basic viewpoint, the rule of thumb, which people, particularly scholars, scientists, and others, pick up and often claim or actually believe, is that essentially conspiracy theories are inherently irrational, or so unlikely as to be essentially inherently irrational. Okay, maybe there's one every now and then, but they basically are irrelevant to world events and to what happens. They don't happen. They're technically impossible to carry out or extremely difficult. People can't get away with conspiracies extremely rarely, or can't get away with them except extremely rarely. That's the viewpoint. This is not based on an empirical study of crime statistics or other data. It's widely asserted in an anecdotal way by the users of the term conspiracy theory. So this is an article I wrote about this question. Are conspiracy theories inherently irrational? And the answer is no, they're not. And in fact, they're rational. And in fact, they occur. Conspiracies at some level are actually fairly common. Now, I think it's important to understand that conspiracy theory is often being used to mean something like a totally crazy, irrational theory which is contradicted heavily by the facts. But it's worth remembering its literal meaning is simply a theory of a criminal or some kind of conspiracy behind some negative event. And this term, this use of the phrase conspiracy theories, become extremely ubiquitous in the last several years, especially with the COVID pandemic and questions about it, where even the notion that it might have come from a laboratory leak rather than deliberate release was labeled for over a year as a conspiracy theory, even though it's not a conspiracy theory, it's an accident theory. To be sure, some people suspect or believe that it was not an accident, that there was a deliberate release of a genetically engineered pathogen. Clearly, we don't know if that's true or not, but that is also being ruled out by the heavy use of the term conspiracy theory. And this is an article, a recent article by Nicholas Wade, the science reporter from the New York Times, on this use, amongst other things, on the origins of COVID and the use of the term conspiracy theory by Peter Daszak of the Ego Health Alliance and many prominent figures involved in the COVID response, involved in virology, to stigmatize even the hypothesis that this might be an accidental release, a goof, not deliberate, not a conspiracy, but just a screw up at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, or perhaps somewhere else, but certainly the suspicions focus on the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And it's worth noting in this context, the term conspiracy theory is being used in the following way. The letter sought to squelch all discussion of the possibility that the virus had escaped from a lab by deriding it as a conspiracy theory. Of course, it wasn't a conspiracy theory. An accident is not a conspiracy theory. But let's think about actual conspiracy theories where you or someone or I or people suspect that there is a criminal conspiracy involving two or more people to do something. In particular, the term conspiracy theory is often evoked in discussions of murders or possible murders, usually of powerful people, but sometimes they're mass events like the Columbine shooting. It is also used in the context of suspicious suicides or accidents like the suicide of so-called hedge fund billionaire Jeffrey Epstein. There are many examples of these, both suicides and accidents that people wonder about. It is often used to refer to questions about the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963, and of course, certain theories and certain ideas about the September 11 attacks. And it's often paired with other terminology and other language. For example, that the conspiracy theory has actually been debunked. Conspiracy theorist is a label of people who have conspiracy theories. And sometimes the terms denialism, or pseudoscience. That's why in my plot I showed the use of denialism and pseudoscience. Denialism and denier is a very recent usage. Pseudoscience actually goes pretty far back, but it began accelerating, particularly in the context of paranormal phenomenon, UFOs, or parapsychology. You'll see the term pseudoscience, as well as conspiracy theory, used to dismiss these ideas. And I'm talking here about not paranormal phenomenon, but violent events, murders, assassinations, possible use of biological weapons, for example. So what's critical is conspiracy is recognized in common law and people are convicted of it all the time. This is a whole bunch of mostly drug-related cases that turned up in a search. Okay, so conspiracies happen and people get convicted of it all the time, probably daily. And I wanted to look specifically at murders because actually conspiracy theory often refers to actual clear murders like President Kennedy or alleged murders, suspicious suicides like Jeffrey Epstein. So what do statistics, official statistics about murders tell us about conspiracies? Well, if we go down here, we'll see that with a single victim, multiple offenders, and that's the common usage meaning of conspiracy, 2 or more people committed the murders. We find that 12.8% of the murders in 2019, 960 cases, were multiple offenders, conspiracy. There are also a smaller number of cases with multiple victims and I should say multiple victims and multiple offenders, and that's 1.9%. So it adds up to a little under 15% of murders are thought to be known to be committed by conspiracies. That's not a small fraction. It's not 0.001% or even 1%. It's a substantial proportion of murders are committed by conspiracies based on the actual convictions. Something else that's worth noting is a lot of murders, even though it's a serious crime and it's investigated heavily and it does have higher what they call clearance rates than, say, robberies or other petty crimes. Single victim unknown offenders. That's a way of saying they couldn't find who did it, 25.4%. And multiple victims with unknown offenders, 2.4%. So over 27%, close to a third of murders go unsolved according to these official statistics. And I'm not going to go into the various problems with them. The term clearance doesn't actually refer to a successful prosecution and conviction in general in murder statistics. It means that the police referred a suspect to the district attorney or whoever's responsible for prosecution. In some jurisdictions, it even just refers to the police identified a suspect, such as a gang member, and didn't really do anything. So these numbers are puffed up, and the percentage of people who are actually convicted of murders is probably significantly lower than these may indicate. Nonetheless, let's use the 27% or so, a little bit less than a third of murders are unknown. We don't know who committed them. Well, what's important to realize if you look into these statistics closely is that a high fraction of unsolved murders involve gang violence or organized crime. They're actually conspiracies. That's part of the reason that they don't go solved, is because people who might come forward are frightened and afraid very often of retaliation, including themselves being murdered by the gang or the organized crime group. And you can look through different articles on this. One thing I noted in searching for this information is that an awful lot of articles that come up in online searches use the language gun violence, unsolved shootings. They stay away from and manage to talk around this issue that most of the crimes are actually gang violence. They're not a lone perpetrator, and they involve criminal activities like drugs usually or some other criminal activity. But in fact, if you read closely, you realize an awful lot of these unsolved murders in Chicago, they're typically in these rough inner city neighborhoods, the south side of Chicago, or certain areas in LA or Oakland or in California, other places. That's what's going on here. And they're unsolved because obviously the murderers are not going to confess very easily. And if someone did see something, they're afraid of retaliation from the criminals. In a domestic violence case, and it's just sort of a random, somebody kills somebody in a bar fight, things like that, that is much less of a concern. And so those cases are easier to actually convict someone. But when you have a significant gang, especially a murderous group, a lot of people clam up. And we can understand and appreciate why they clam up. It's not unreasonable if you see something to keep your mouth shut. Even though you might find it wrong, you weren't involved. But even if you saw something that could lead to a conviction, you're taking your life and your family's life in your hands. That also obviously applies to other kinds of organized conspiracies in crime. There are many, many examples of unsolved murders and disappearances in so-called organized crime or the mob or the mafia. I list some very famous ones here, like Arnold Rothstein, Bugsy Siegel, Albert Anastasia, Sam Giancana, and Johnny Roselli, who were both being interviewed about their possible involvement in the attempts to assassinate Castro and the Kennedy assassination, and other people. Some people disappeared, like Jimmy Hoffa and John Gotti's neighbor, John Favara. The history of organized crime is full of unsolved murders and unsolved disappearances. In fact, prominent organized crime figures are rarely convicted of murders, even though they're likely guilty of either doing them or ordering them frequently. It's hard to prove. Right? It happens behind closed doors, one-on-one with the killer. He says, go kill this guy, and frequently they don't use that kind of language. They say, this is a problem person, do something creative, I don't want to know the details, get lost, right? Hard to prove that. So the prosecutions often involve, for example, financial crimes like tax evasion. That's how they got at Al Capone. He was never convicted of murder. So murders are actually difficult to prove, particularly conspiracies. Not that the murder occurred, although that can be an issue like in suspicious suicides or accidents, but it's also just difficult to prove that someone has had someone killed. So the actual data we have on murders and lots of, quote, conspiracy theories, unquote, are murder cases, whether it's Kennedy or September 11 or the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, if it was released, if a deliberate release of a genetically engineered organism took place, like the anthrax attacks in 2001, it has happened before, that is a murder case, a mass murder case. So are there high-level international conspiracies? The street gangs and things tend to operate in certain bad neighborhoods, and you might say, well, what they are these, quote, conspiracy theories that involve people all over the world, for example. Could that possibly happen? There are actually well-documented court cases of high-level international conspiracies involving competing groups, notably companies involved in price-fixing cartels. An example which is particularly relevant to our current situation with COVID is a conspiracy that went on in the 1990s and probably 80s, maybe much earlier, involving officials at Archer Daniels Midland, a large food company politically very connected in both Republican and Democratic parties, Pfizer, the drug company, and several other companies in Japan and Korea and around the world. And I'm going to talk mostly here briefly about this was to fix the price of citric acid. For some reason, when you search on this, you often get information on another part of the conspiracy that involved fixing lysine, an obscure food additive. The big money item was citric acid, which is a major component of Coca-Cola and other sodas. And most of world production of citric acid was produced by Pfizer and Archer Daniels Midland, and they cooperated to fix the price in a big scandal. And they were caught and in this case they were caught because an insider, one of the people at ADM, for his own reasons, blew the whistle. That's the informant in Kurt Eichenwald's book here. But again, it's very difficult to pick these things up without an insider who blabs or something like that. It's not that easy to prove these things are going on. Nonetheless, they have been proven in a number of cases. Well, do cartels actually get away with these agreements? One argument would be, well, okay, yeah, that happened, but they got caught. How could somebody get away with it? Again, we get into this false claim that we can easily see as false with the murder statistics and data, that somehow people can't get away with conspiracy. Somebody will talk, and it's not just a rumor. Remember, it's not just somebody, some mob hitman babbling at a bar to one of his friends and the word gets around what happened. That's not going to hold up in a court of law in many cases, right? We're talking about it goes to court. We can actually prove it happened beyond a reasonable doubt. And as we can see from murder statistics and killings, often that's just not possible. Well, are there examples of suspicious rises of price of products and services which nobody can explain that look like they might be a price-fixing deal? Well, recently there's been a dramatic increase in the price of insulin, which is used by diabetics to stay alive, and mysteriously it suddenly doubled, tripled, went way up in price. There's been a lot of controversy over it, And yet it's proven very difficult to prove that there's a price fixing agreement. Okay, remember, insulin doesn't require some exotic material. There's no oil to get out of the ground. You just cook it in fats. They have genetically engineered bacteria. It no longer comes from animals that have to be slaughtered. You just produce it and synthesize it in, basically vats full of bacteria. The technology has obviously been improving for decades. It's been genetically engineered and produced this way for decades. It's not getting harder to produce. Nonetheless, the price has soared. It's been the subject of investigations, political commentary like by Senator Bernie Sanders and others. It's pretty clear something fishy is going on here. But proving it, and it seems like a very plausible and blatant case, has proven very difficult. Another suspicious happening, not as clear-cut, is the dramatic rise in oil prices around 2000 or so that followed a series of mergers of competing oil companies, British Petroleum and Amoco, Exxon and Mobil, Conoco and Phillips. There was criticism of these mergers that it wasn't a good idea because it would make it easier for them to fix the prices. It's never been proven they're doing that. I'm not saying we know they're doing it, but lo and behold, after these mergers and coincident with the mergers, the price of oil rose substantially. You might wonder about that. That's not proof, and that's part of the problem. Unlike a murder where you have a bullet in somebody or something like that, proving that a price increase is due to a secret illegal deal, right, a conspiracy, that there's even been a crime, is very difficult. So the conclusion I want to leave you with is that conspiracy theories are rational in many cases. And this isn't just, theoretical. Historical data on unsolved murders demonstrates that proving a conspiracy beyond a reasonable doubt is difficult. Criminal conspiracies are not like laboratory experiments or astronomical observations. The, quote, scientific method is based on a highly controlled environment or situation, not a situation like a crime where the criminals are actively trying to avoid detection and do various things. So instincts from being trained in science and supposedly rational thought don't really apply here. The belief common among intellectuals that conspiracy theories are inherently irrational, or so unlikely as to be essentially inherently irrational, is just demonstrably false from the history of murders and various other criminal investigations. This concludes this video presentation. If you like this video, please click like. Please click subscribe and the notification bell if you would like to receive more content from us. You can avoid internet censorship by subscribing directly to our RSS news feed. Please consider sharing the link by email and on your website or blog, in addition to liking, upvoting, or sharing on increasingly censored, advertising beholden, big company social media. We have encountered such censorship. Mathematical software is developing algorithms and software to automate data analysis, reducing the risks of costly errors and increasing the predictive power of the results. You can support our work financially by subscribing on our Patreon page, https://www.patreon.com/mathsoft, or scanning the QR code in the lower right corner.